tanks in Ashes of Creation. Will there be enough of them? This video is brought to you by the Rockcock. MMOs always seem to have a shortage of tanks, so likely the answer to the question, will there be enough tanks in Ashes of Creation, is no. So maybe the better question is, will Ashes of Creation have a better tank to DPS ratio compared to other games? Well, of course, this early in development is very hard to say, but we can of course speculate. Let's look at the pros and cons, and from there make an educated guess as to whether Ashes will have more or less tanks than average. The main pro, from my perspective, is that Ashes group size is 8 and class balance is at that level. What I don't know, however, is whether PvE encounters will be balanced at an 8-man group size or not. I also don't know if there will be greatly reduced rewards for zerging down the open world content to discourage zerging. If there are no diminished rewards for zerging the content, then the amount of tanks might be somewhat irrelevant as groups just send sheer numbers at content. If we assume that 8-man groups will be optimal for group PvE encounters, then that is a net positive for the number of tanks available in Ashes of Creation. Many MMOs have group content scaled to smaller groups. WoW is 5-man, Final Fantasy is 4-man groups. 8-man groups being optimal would be a bonus for achieving a better DPS to tank ratio. For now, despite not having all the information we need, I am sticking the 8-man group size in the pro category. Let's look at some cons now. First, not having multi-spec and or ease of changing spec will likely limit the number of tanks. WoW makes it easy to have multiple specs and change specs. Final Fantasy, you can easily switch jobs and be a tank if you consistently get annoyed by the lack of tanks. Ashes does not have multi-spec, which I personally think is fine and I don't have a problem with, but it will undoubtedly reduce the amount of tanks in this game. Also, tanks are only available with the Tank Primary Archetype, so it is not as simple as switching out your secondary archetype to become a tank. There is potentially one exception, as it seems as though the Summoner archetype with a tank secondary might be a capable main tank. So there might be one class that can switch to tank without having to completely reroll a new character, but for everyone else, if you want to reroll as a tank, you will have to re-level a new character. And in Ashes, leveling takes a lot longer than many modern MMOs. It is not going to be an alt-friendly MMO. It is supposed to take 45 days at 46 hours per day playtime to hit max level. On top of that, gearing out a character at max level will take a long time as well, so it is not easy to just reroll. I put this firmly in the con category in terms of it likely reducing the amount of available tanks, even though I personally have no problem with these design choices. Next, let's look at spec ratios. What do I mean by spec ratios? I'm talking about the total number of specs in the game and what percentage of those specs can be a tank. WoW has 36 total specs, 6 can tank, so 16% of specs can be a tank. Ashes has 64 total specs and 9 can tank if you include the Summoner tank, so 14%. A slight edge to WoW. But if you consider that 6 out of 12 classes can tank in WoW and respecs and multi-specs are a thing, 50% of classes can tank versus 2 out of 8 classes in Ashes 25%. So in comparison to WoW, this is a con, again in terms of the number of tanks available, but also again this is not a design choice I have a problem with. Compared to most MMOs in Final Fantasy, 21% of specs can tank, and it's very easy to switch specs, but you do have to level each spec. Again, though, Final Fantasy has 4-man group content, which means less tanks per DPS. Overall, the 21% of specs being a tank is quite a bit higher than Ashes at 16%. Compared to Arcade, which Ashes is very similar to, Arcade has a system which does make it easy for anyone to switch to a tank. Basically, you choose from 11 different skill sets, combining 3 of them to make your class, and these can be switched out. You do have to level your skills, but you don't have to completely reroll an alt if you want to switch to tank. That being said, out of the 220 possible combinations, only 5 to 6 are viable tanks depending on the meta, so only 2.7% of specs. Ashes beats Arcade in that regard, but Arcade offsets this by making it easier to reroll as a tank. So overall, even though it is very early, I think the spec ratio is not favorable for Ashes in comparison to other MMOs. I'm a chicken. Bagok! Next, let's talk about things we just don't know enough about to even speculate. We don't know how hard it will be to level a tank. In a lot of MMOs, leveling a tank in the open world is painful. Leveling through dungeons is doable, though not always optimal. Leveling in Ashes, creation tanks leveled through group PvP might be a pain, as most of it is in the open world, and there might not be enough of it to go around to level 100% through group PvE, and you have to manually find groups. All these things I think are positive for the game as a whole, as they encourage socializing and making friends, which is what MMOs used to be about, but it might mean less tanks. Another thing we don't know is how good tanks will be in PvP. We do know that historically tanks are often not good in PvP, and we do know that Ashes is a PvP heavy MMO, so if tanks are not super useful in PvP, that will be a net negative for the tank population. So just to place my educated guess, I think based on the limited information we currently have, that Ashes will have a lower tank to DPS ratio than other MMOs. Probably way too early to make that determination, but hey, what else do we have to talk about right now? What are some things that Ashes could do to bolster the tank population? The biggest thing I think they could do is let the secondary archetype of tank turn more classes into tanks than just summoner. This might be controversial, but I think it would not drastically alter the design of Ashes and would alleviate a major bottleneck that many MMOs have, which is a lack of tanks. Less controversial things are to make tanks very viable and useful in PvP, allow tanks to level efficiently, and finally make PvE content centered around 8-man group sizes to improve the DPS to tank ratio. That is what the devs can do, but what about the players? Well, consider this a PSA that tanks might be even more scarce in this MMO than other MMOs, and consider that alts will not be as common or easy to keep relevant as in other MMOs. So consider becoming a tank at launch. Also, it is going to be very important to be in an organized guild, more so in this game than in most modern MMOs. So consider joining one before launch so that you can organize and see what everyone else is going to roll. Many guilds have a roster that will show how many tanks, healers, etc. are going to be rolled. If your guild lacks tanks, consider being a tank. If there are enough tanks, great. Being in a guild with enough tanks will be incredibly helpful to you as a player. That's it for the tanks discussion, but don't go anywhere, because today I have an original song crafted by yours truly to take us out. In the next video, I might do a channel update. I don't plan to do too many of those because I always find them a bit odd myself, but the old Asmongold bump happens and I'd like to talk about it and quite a few other things. Beep, boo, 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 boop, boop. As I walked through the valleys of ashes of creation, I searched for a tank, but he wasn't there. Even Zillin wasn't around, so I had to tank them bosses myself. But I couldn't keep my pants on, and it went really bad. I've been spending most my life living in a tankless paradise. We keep spending most our lives living in a tankless paradise.